So the other day I was looking through some old books of mine and I came across this series of books, the Kingdom series, that I really loved as a kid, but I hated to read as well when I was a kid. So I thought there's got to be something here of value. So I figured I would reread the series and figure out what that was. So a little bit of background knowledge of the series before I start my review of the first book. So it was written by Chuck Black, like I said, and it is a children's fantasy series, which is a biblical allegory. And he initially wrote it for his kids. He didn't initially intend for it to be published. And he wrote it because his kids got kind of bored with him when he was trying to teach them about the Bible and stuff. So he wrote this to try to teach them about the Bible in a more interesting and entertaining way. And he wrote the third book first, and then he wrote the others. But yeah, so that's a little bit of the background knowledge of this series. So the things that I liked about the first book, Kingdom's Dawn, is it's short. And I'm going to acknowledge that some certain things are good for kids' books, but not good for what I like to read. So the length is short. It's 160 pages, 30 some thousand words. And the text is the font is a little bit bigger, so it made it easier to read and didn't give me so much of a headache. And it's very fast paced. I don't like that in necessarily in books that I read, unless I'm reading a short story. But is fast paced, which I think is what I liked about the book. Is something was always happening. There's always action happening. You're moving from one thing to the next. We don't really have time to sit and breathe. So as a kid, I think that's what I liked about it, and I think that's fine for a children's book. But I don't really care for it now. Now we're going to move into the things that I just really don't like. Oh, I guess there's some good creative ideas in this book. For example, the event that's supposed to represent the flood, as in Noah's flood. It's very creative, but I'm sad that it never comes about again, and he doesn't really do much whole lot with it, which is the flood is these microscopic creatures that come over the land in this big giant swarm, humongous swarm, and they just eat everything that's living. And I'm that's actually really creative. I actually really like that. I would love to see that implemented more and figure out how people deal with this, because you could write an entire that whole event of Noah's flood, represented as this. You could write an entire book just on that. Seriously, he could have written so many more books, but no, because the pace of this book is really, really fast. Anyway, what I don't like. So the main characters are all very boring and bland, very uncreative. The main character is a farm boy. Big surprise there for a fantasy series. And he, at the end of this book, he becomes a Knight of the King. And that's his arc in this book. However, that's not really much of an arc, considering he was already good at sword fighting at the very beginning. And he has a few training montages, I guess, here and there, but it's boiled down to a paragraph instead of actually writing scenes to tell us what the king taught him. It's just basically and he trained, basically, is how that goes. So I don't really appreciate the pacing. I appreciate the pace is fast, but I don't appreciate the way that he does the fast pace. Because things are boiled down to and he trained, and they grew closer as friends, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of telling and not showing. Instead of just him writing a scene to show us that this is happening, he is just telling us that it happens, and that really annoys me, even in children's books, because even in children's media, they know how to do show and don't tell, and do actual good storytelling. So a lot of the stuff is very obvious, and I understand that this is for kids, and so some things need to be a little bit more obvious, but something like character names, Lucius, you can probably tell who that character is supposed to be. And then there's Zane and Zabel. Yes, that's supposed to be Cain and Abel. Um, that's very uncreative. And there's actually a map in the front of the book of all these books, so I appreciate that, it being a fantasy series. But there's some certain places like the Red Sea is the Red Canyon. Yeah, so yeah, not especially creative. I don't appreciate sometimes there are unnecessary sentences in this book, just things that just unnecessarily don't need to be said. Like for example, they were talking about how this one character loves the challenge of a sword fight. Um, and then that sentence is followed by he was very skilled with the sword, or he was very skilled at sword fighting, or something like that. And it's like that is a very unnecessary sentence because you just established that he would be good at that because he enjoys the challenge of it. So yeah, kind of unnecessary sentence there. But one of the things that makes me the most mad, not besides the character being very bland, besides this the showing, the telling and not showing, is the fact that this book ends where it shouldn't. This book ends at the end of Act 2 of the story, because basically it ends when the character is in despair, and then he gets new inspiration, like when he's knighted by the king. That's how the book ends, is him getting knighted by the king, who is supposed to represent God. Anyway, he gets knighted by the king, and he has new inspiration to go save his people from this lord who has a bunch of slaves, because he spent a bunch of time as being a slave. That's one of the things in the book. But anyway, so it ends with him like being inspired to go save the people. That's not where a book is supposed to end. You should have a few chapters left, and actually talk. That's the beginning of the third act, when he would actually go and free his people. And the book should have ended with them crossing the Red Canyon into the New Promised Land, or whatever you want to call it. So that's where the book should have ended, but that's not where the book ends. And it makes me really mad, because it's just like basic storytelling. Like that's like, yes, like the typically in a story, the part where the character is at their lowest and then they gain new inspiration, like that is typically my favorite part. Typically my favorite part of a lot of movies. But this is where the book ends. Like the reason why that moment is so powerful and so special, typically in the structure of a story, is because you have the third act, which comes after it, and then they like rise up from their low point, and they accomplish their goal. But this, no, doesn't really happen, and it's really annoying. So that is the main things I have to say about this book. However, there is one thing I want to say that makes me really mad. That it's more of an issue with the second book that I haven't reread yet, but I remember it. I remembered it in the second chapter. It like kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, oh crap, this is really problematic. So the main character's father ends up adopting this little girl because she was like being abused by this woman, and so he like buys her from this woman, and then like adopts her as his daughter. And so the main character, Leonid, and this little girl, Tess, I can't remember how you're supposed to pronounce her name, but they grew up for several years having a brother-sister relationship. Like, so, yeah. So when Tess turns like 16 or 17 and has gone through puberty and looks more like a woman, Leonid gains a romantic interest in her, and they end up getting married. And that makes me so mad, because that's disgusting. Like, I don't care that they're not related. That is disgusting. And that should not happen. Like, that's in a children's book. Like, if you want to include that kind of stuff in an adult fantasy setting, like J.R.R. Martin with his Game of Thrones books, fine. I don't care. That's for adults. You can include topics like that, but no, not in this. This is a children's fantasy series. That's just disgusting. Please keep that out of my children's fantasy books. I would appreciate it. So, anyway, to sum this up, I would not recommend that anyone read these books. They're pretty bad. They're not great. There's much other better children's media you could be reading. If you want to read a children's fantasy series, read the Chronicles of Narnia or read The Hobbit. I'm sure there's other ones as well, but those are the two that I know off the top of my head. So anyway, I will see you all sometime in the future, if I don't die.